This is a basic review of the female reproductive system, or at least the basics. So in the left side of the screen, or left upper side of the screen, we can see the uterus. The uterus has three layers. So the perimetrium is the outer connective tissue layer. The thick muscular layer is the myometrium. And then the endometrium, the inner layer, is actually made of two sublayers, the stratum functionalis and the stratum basalis. The stratum functionalis is what builds up during the proliferative phase of the uterine cycle and then is shed during menses. The stratum basalis stays constant. We see the fallopian tubes curving around and they end in the fimbriae, or the little finger-like structures, and then we see the ovaries, which are the gonads in females. We see a series of ligaments. The suspensory ligament holds the ovary and contains the ovarian artery and vein. And we have the large broad ligament, which connects the fallopian tube and uterus to the iliac bones. And then we see the ovarian ligament, which attaches the ovary basically to the uterine wall, basically. Okay, so what happens physiologically? So I guess we can talk about hormone production initially. So during puberty, we have a spike in GnRH from the hypothalamus, or gonadotropin releasing hormone, which is the same in males. Okay, exactly the same in males. This is going to stimulate the anterior pituitary, and here's where you get a 2-for-1 deal. You get these gonadotropes, so luteinizing hormone, or LH for short, and follicle stimulating hormone, or FSH for short. Okay, same thing happens in males. Now, where they act is a little bit different. And they have numerous effects. So at least on hormone production here, LH is going to stimulate the thecal cells. So I have an ova drawn in the follicle. So we have different cells surrounding the follicle. We got thecal cells and we have granulosa cells. And then we have fluid in the open space there. So thecal cells actually produce something called androstenedione, which is an androgenic hormone, so a male type hormone. So we're going to understand that females, they generally have, this is generalization, about 1/20th the testosterone of males. But if you look at the measurements on lab work of testosterone and estrogen, females make more testosterone than estrogen, about 5 times more. We measure testosterone in nanograms, and we measure estrogen in picograms. It's actually less. Okay, same thing goes with males, but males have more testosterone. So anyway, luteinizing hormone is going to stimulate the thecal cells to produce androstenedione. So androstenedione will then go into the granulosa cells, the nearby granulosa cells, and via the aromatase enzyme, this is going to convert androstenedione, convert it to estrogen. And then you got the estrogen hormone, okay? FSH actually helps with the aromatase process in the granulosa cells of converting androstenedione to estrogen. So that's how you make estrogen, okay? So androgenic hormones in females are made in the ovaries, okay? In the follicle, in the thecal cells. The other place we can get androgenic hormones, which we can see on the next whiteboard for the next video, is the adrenal glands. So the adrenal glands make a couple of different hormones. The primary one is DHEA, or dihydroepiandrosterone. That can also get converted to androstenedione, right? So more androgenic hormones. Anyway, that's how we make hormones, right? So we'll talk about drugs in a little bit later. So we have 2 cycles going on. Okay, we've got the ovarian cycle and the uterine cycle. So what's going on in the ovary and what's going on in the uterus through an average 28-day cycle. Obviously, this can vary. It can be shorter and it can be longer. So some people say 21 days up to 40 days is, potentially normal. So in the ovarian cycle, so the oogonia, okay, so females, as they're, developing, we have oogonia. In the ovaries, these progress to primary oocytes and then on to secondary oocytes, which I didn't write secondary oocyte on there, but I should have that on there. And then we start the follicular phase from day 1. So the follicular phase, what's happening is FSH is stimulating the development of a follicle. So a couple follicles get picked out, a couple ova that are developing follicles, and then one usually becomes the primary follicle, which is the Graafian follicle. We have that on there. So the Graafian follicle. So FSH helps stimulate the oocytes to become mature into a Graafian follicle. And we got our follicle, we pick out, hey, this is the one that we're going to release the ova into the fallopian tube during ovulation, okay? And the female can release more than one egg. This is also seen more likely to happen when there's fertility drugs involved, like Clomid. Anyway, so FSH is stimulating that. So through the follicular phase, we're maturing follicles with an ova to prepare for ovulation. Now, and that's leading up to day 14. So that's basically day 1 through day 14. Okay, ovulation usually occurs day 14, 15, somewhere around there. Now, what's happening in the uterus? Well, the first 5 days or so is menses. Okay, we're shedding the stratum functionalis and having menses. And then we go into the proliferative phase. And this is where the stratum functionalis is being built up. So estrogen levels are stimulating the stratum functionalis to thicken and much increase in blood vessels. So we're increasing blood vessel growth or angiogenesis into the stratum functionalis. And that's also leading up to ovulation. Okay. So look at our hormones where estrogen levels are climbing, FSH levels are climbing slightly, and LH levels are climbing more so as we get towards day 14, right? Obviously, as LH goes up, we're going to make more estrogen, but we're getting to that peak of LH at day 14, which is ovulation. My graph isn't, the best. Now, progesterone levels are low. So during menses, estrogen and progesterone levels are low or lower, and progesterone does not climb till later. Okay. So then we have ovulation at day 14. What stimulates ovulation? So once we have a mature Graafian follicle, thanks to follicle stimulating hormone, luteinizing hormone levels spike. They spike it around day 14. We have ovulation. So what happens is the secondary oocyte basically rips out of the follicle and gets released into the fallopian tube. LH stimulates that because it actually stimulates these little enzymes that kind of cut out the oocyte from the follicle and allows it to get released into the fallopian tube. This then starts the luteal phase of the ovarian cycle. So after we have that leaves, we have what's left of the follicle, and this basically converts into something called the corpus luteum, which is very important. So the corpus luteum, right, that's why it's called the luteal phase, is going to release a hormone called progesterone. That's why progesterone levels start to spike after day 14. Progesterone's job is to continue to increase the proliferation of the stratum functionalis and continue to increase blood vessel production. And we can see that in my fantastic drawing. And this is now the secretory phase of the uterine cycle. So what differences do we see here? Well, estrogen produces more of a thin cervical mucus to allow a good environment for sperm cells. And then progesterone is going to produce more of a thicker mucus. So in the secretory phase, and progesterone levels spike in the luteal phase in the ovarian cycle, well, what's going to happen? Fertilization should have already occurred, okay, in the lower 1/3 of the fallopian tube. And now progesterone is going to stimulate thicker mucus because now we don't want any more sperm coming in, right? So implantation has not occurred. So progesterone will continue to do that and continue to maintain the stratum functionalis so we can have potential implantation into the stratum functionalis, into the uterine wall. So if we do have implantation, well, we can see back in the uterus there, HCG, or human chorionic gonadotropin, is starting to get released from the cells that are going to go on to form the placenta. So HCG is going to maintain the corpus luteum. If we maintain the corpus luteum, we're going to maintain progesterone production. If we maintain progesterone production, we're going to maintain the stratum functionalis and maintain the uterine wall. Okay, so we can have growth of our zygote, right, into a fetus. So that all needs to happen. Okay, and then we can see our hormone levels. If there is implantation, we can see estrogen levels go up, up, up. Progesterone levels go up, up, up. HCG levels are going to go up, up, up really fast. Okay, exponentially. And then LH and FSH are going to go down, right? We don't want to have high levels of FSH because FSH is going to do what? It's going to mature another follicle for the next cycle. We don't need to do that. Now, the graph I drew, we can see those hormones go up, up, up. Now, if there's not implantation and HCG levels don't go up, we don't maintain the corpus luteum and actually degenerates in something called the corpus albicans, which doesn't release progesterone. And then if we don't release progesterone, we don't maintain the stratum functionalis. So actually, progesterone and estrogen levels fall down. And then we're going to have menses day 1 through 5. Okay, we're going to repeat our cycle. So that's the difference. So what about some basic drugs? So Clomid, clomiphene is the generic name. So it's a fertility drug. It's a SERM, or selective estrogen receptor modulator. How does that work? We're going to block estrogen receptors. We're not going to lower estrogen levels per se, but we're going to block estrogen receptors on the anterior pituitary. It's going to trick it into thinking, well, estrogen levels are low. We need to produce more LH and FSH because of negative feedback. We have less negative feedback because estrogen isn't binding to those receptors in the anterior pituitary. Those are going to grow up, make more FSH. We're going to mature the follicle better. Okay. And that's even going to potentially produce multiple mature follicles, and you can ovulate and have multiple eggs that are released. Okay. And then we could potentially have, twins and triplets and quadruplets and so on and so forth. Okay. Now, LH, right, or using HCG as LH, that was horribly explained. So HCG, believe it or not, is an LH mimetic. It mimics LH, so it can have effects of LH on all these tissues. Okay, we can also use both of these drugs in men as well. So LH can be given to stimulate ovulation. Okay, another drug, so I wrote AIs on there. So AI stands for aromatase inhibitor. There's a couple of aromatase inhibitors like letrozole, anastrozole, which is arimidex, exemestane, which is aromacin, so they can block the aromatase enzyme. And by doing that, they'll block the conversion of androstenedione into estrogen. So when we use this, so estrogen-sensitive breast cancer, one time we would do this in females because we don't want high levels of estrogen. Okay, so that's the basics of the ovarian cycle, the uterine cycle, and we can see the graph of how these hormones will change.